Emma Torres adjusted her hiking boots one final time. The leather still stiff from the box, despite 3 days of breaking them in around her apartment. The Colorado morning air carried that crisp bite that promised snow within the week, and she pulled her fleece jacket tighter as she checked her backpack straps. Beside her, Rusty panted happily, his golden coat catching the early sunlight filtering through the pine trees. "Ready for our adventure, boy?" she asked, scratching behind his ears in that spot that always made his leg twitch with pleasure. Rusty's tail wagged so hard his entire back end wiggled, and Emma couldn't help but laugh. After 6 months of grueling veterinary courses, this weekend camping trip felt like exactly what they both needed. The trailhead at Bear Creek was nearly empty at 7 in the morning, just how Emma preferred it. She'd discovered this particular trail during her undergraduate years at Colorado State, and it had become her go-to escape when the pressures of student life became overwhelming. Rusty had been with her for most of those trips, ever since she'd adopted him as a gangly puppy from the shelter 3 years ago. They set off at an easy pace, Emma's hiking poles clicking against the rocky path while Rusty bounded ahead, nose to the ground, investigating every interesting scent. The dog had an adventurous spirit that matched her own, always eager to explore new trails and discover hidden meadows. It was one of the things Emma loved most about him, his unbridled enthusiasm for whatever lay around the next bend. 2 miles in, they paused at Sunset Ridge, a rocky outcropping that offered spectacular views of the valley below. Emma pulled out her water bottle and poured some into Rusty's collapsible bowl, watching as he lapped it up gratefully. The morning hike had already worked up a good sweat, and they still had another for miles to their intended campsite. "Take it easy, buddy," she said, noticing how he kept scanning the tree line with unusual intensity. "Just squirrels and maybe some deer. Nothing to get worked up about." But Rusty's behavior remained odd as they continued hiking. His usual playful bounding gave way to alert, focused movement. His ears stayed pricked forward, and every few minutes he would stop completely, nose raised to test the wind. Emma found herself growing uneasy, though she couldn't pinpoint exactly why. The trail wound deeper into the wilderness, following an old creek bed that had carved a path through dense stands of aspen and pine. Emma had hiked this route dozens of times, but today something felt different. The forest seemed quieter than usual, as if the usual chorus of birds and small animals had decided to take the day off. Round noon, they reached Whitewater Falls, a modest cascade that tumbled over smooth granite into a clear pool below. This was traditionally their lunch spot, and Emma gratefully shrugged off her pack. She was setting up their picnic when she heard it, a low, rumbling growl that definitely hadn't come from Rusty. The black bear emerged from the dense undergrowth, about 50 yards downstream, massive and dark against the golden aspen leaves. Emma's breath caught in her throat as she took in the animal's size. She'd encountered bears before during her hiking adventures, but never one this large, and never when she was this far from the main trail. "Rusty, come," she whispered, but her voice came out as barely a croak. The dog had spotted the bear too, and was standing rigid, every muscle tensed. Emma could see the conflict in his posture, his instincts torn between protecting her and recognizing a threat far beyond his capabilities. The bear raised its massive head, testing the air. For a moment that stretched like an eternity, the three of them formed a triangle of tension beside the waterfall. Emma slowly reached for the bear spray clip to her belt, moving with the deliberate care her wilderness training had drilled into her. That's when everything went wrong. A sudden gust of wind carried their scent directly to the bear, and the animal's demeanor shifted instantly from curious to aggressive. It rose up on its hind legs, standing nearly 8 feet tall, and let out a roar that echoed off the canyon walls. The sound triggered something primal in Rusty, and before Emma could stop him, he charged. "Rusty, no!" Emma screamed, but the golden retriever was already sprinting toward the bear, barking with a ferocity she'd never heard from him before. The bear dropped to all fours and charged to meet him, and Emma watched in horror as her beloved companion disappeared into the thick brush. With several 100 pounds of angry bear, the sounds of the confrontation, snarling, barking, the crash of breaking branches, lasted only seconds before giving way to an ominous silence. Emma stood frozen, bear spray still clutched in her trembling hand, staring at the wall of vegetation that had swallowed both animals. "Rusty," she called her, voice breaking. "Rusty, come back." But only the sound of the waterfall answered her desperate pleas. Jake Mitchell's radio crackled to life at 3:47 p.m., interrupting his lunch break at the Larimer County Search and Rescue Station. The voice of dispatcher Carol Jenkins cut through the static. "With practiced efficiency, Jake, we've got a missing dog situation up at Bear Creek. Owner's been searching for 6 hours, getting dark soon. Can you respond?" Jake set down his sandwich and reached for his gear bag. "Copy that, Carol. Any details on the dog?" "Golden Retriever, 3 years old, answers to Rusty. Owner is Emma Torres, 24, veterinary student. She's at the Whitewater Falls area, about 4 miles up the main trail." As Jake loaded his truck with search equipment, he found himself thinking about his own dog, Scout, a German Shepherd mix he'd lost to cancer 2 years earlier. The ache of that loss still caught him off guard sometimes, usually when he was helping reunite other people with their missing pets. It was part of what drove his volunteer work with search and rescue, the hope that he could spare others the pain he'd experienced. The drive to Bear Creek took 20 minutes on winding mountain roads. Jake had been hiking these trails for over a decade, first as a weekend warrior trying to escape his desk job in Fort Collins, then as a volunteer searcher after he'd made the career switch to freelance outdoor photography. He knew every switchback, every potential hazard, every place where a panicked animal might seek shelter. He found Emma Torres exactly where dispatch had indicated, sitting on a boulder beside the waterfall with her head in her hands. Her hiking gear was scattered around her as if she'd been pacing frantically, and her face was streaked with tears and dirt. When she looked up at the sound of his approaching footsteps, Jake was struck by the raw desperation in her brown eyes. "Are you with search and rescue?" she asked, jumping to her feet so quickly she nearly stumbled. "Jake Mitchell," he said, extending his hand. "I'm here to help you find Rusty." The relief that washed over her face was immediately replaced by renewed urgency. "It's been almost 7 hours, she said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "There was a bear, and Rusty charged it to protect me, and they disappeared into the brush over there. And I've been calling and calling, but he won't come back. And what if he's hurt? What if—" "Hey," Jake said gently, placing a steadying hand on her shoulder. "Take a breath. Tell me exactly what happened from the beginning." As Emma recounted the bear encounter, Jake studied the terrain and weather conditions. The temperature was dropping fast as the sun sank behind the peaks, and cloud cover was moving in from the west. They had maybe 2 hours of decent light left. 3 if they were lucky. "Show me where they went into the brush," he said when she finished her account. Emma led him to a trampled area where broken branches and disturbed earth told the story of the confrontation. Jake knelt down, studying the ground with the practiced eye of someone who'd spent years reading sign. He could make out paw prints in the soft soil, both dog and bear, leading away from the waterfall and deeper into the dense forest. "The good news is I don't see any blood," he told Emma, who had been watching his examination with barely contained anxiety. "If there had been serious injury, we'd see evidence of it here." They began following the trail, Jake in the lead with his tracking skills, Emma close behind calling Rusty's name every few minutes. The path led them through increasingly difficult terrain, steep ravines choked with deadfall, narrow game trails that wound between massive boulders, dense thickets of scrub oak that caught at their clothing and gear. An hour into the search, they found the first real clue. Jake spotted it first, a tuft of golden fur caught on a thorny branch about 3 feet off the ground. Emma's breath caught when she saw it. "That's definitely Rusty's fur," she confirmed, her voice tight with worry. "The height suggests he was moving fast when he passed this way." Jake observed, still following or being chased by something larger. They pressed on as darkness began to fall, using headlamps to illuminate their path. Jake called in their position to base camp every 30 minutes, establishing a search pattern that would allow other volunteers to join them if needed. But as the hours passed and the temperature continued to drop, he began to worry about more than just finding the dog. "Emma, he said during one of their brief rest stops. "You need to eat something and drink some water. You're no help to Rusty if you collapse from exhaustion." She shook her head stubbornly. "I can't stop. He's out there somewhere, probably scared and hurt, and I'm the only one who can bring him home." Jake recognized the single-minded determination of someone consumed by guilt and love in equal measure. He'd seen it in other search situations, and he'd felt it himself when Scout was dying. Sometimes the hardest part of search and rescue wasn't finding the missing, it was taking care of the people left behind. "Listen to me," he said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who'd been through similar ordeals. "Rusty is a smart dog, right? He's been hiking these mountains with you for years. He knows how to find water. He knows how to find shelter. Dogs are incredibly resilient." Emma looked at him with eyes that held both hope and skepticism. "How can you be so sure?" Jake thought about Scout, about all the searches that had ended in joyful reunions and the few that hadn't. "Because I've seen what love can make creatures capable of. Rusty didn't charge that bear because he was being aggressive. He did it because he loves you. That same love is going to drive him to survive until we can bring him home." They searched until well past midnight, covering nearly 6 square miles of rugged mountain terrain. When they finally made camp in a small clearing, setting up Jake's emergency shelter and sharing his extra sleeping bag, Emma was barely able to keep her eyes open. "We'll start again at first light," Jake promised as she drifted off to sleep. "We won't give up." But privately, he knew the statistics. Dogs could survive for weeks in the wilderness under the right conditions, but they could also fall victim to predators, exposure, or simple accidents. As he lay awake listening to Emma's exhausted breathing and the night sounds of the forest around them, Jake found himself hoping that somewhere out there, a golden retriever named Rusty was curled up in a warm, dry place, waiting for morning and the sound of familiar voices calling his name. Old Pete Henderson was splitting firewood behind his cabin when he heard the whimpering. The sound was faint, almost lost in the whisper of wind through the pines. But Pete's ears had been trained by 40 years of mountain living to catch the subtlest variations in the forest's natural symphony. He set down his axe and listened, head cocked like the ancient bloodhound he'd once owned. There it was again, a soft, pain sound that definitely wasn't coming from any wild animal he knew. Pete picked up his walking stick and headed toward the sound, his weathered boots making barely a whisper on the carpet of fallen needles. Pete had chosen this remote corner of the Colorado Rockies specifically because it was far from hiking trails and campgrounds. His nearest neighbor was 12 miles away, and that was exactly how he liked it. After retiring from 30 years as a park ranger, he'd had enough of dealing with people and their problems. Up here, with only the wildlife for company, life was simpler, quieter, more honest. The whimpering led him to a shallow ravine about a quarter mile from his cabin, where a small creek wound between moss-covered boulders. There, wedged beneath an overhanging rock ledge, was a golden retriever. The dog was conscious but clearly in distress, favoring his right front leg and sporting several nasty scratches along his flank. "Well, I'll be damned," Pete muttered, approaching slowly with his hands visible. The dog's ears perked up at the sound of his voice, but he didn't try to flee, a sign that he was either too injured or too trusting for his own good. Pete knelt down a few feet away, studying the animal's condition, with the practiced eye of someone who'd dealt with injured wildlife his entire career. The leg didn't appear to be broken, just badly sprained, and the scratches looked like they came from thorns rather than claws. But the dog was clearly exhausted, dehydrated, and probably hadn't eaten in days. "Easy there, boy," Pete said in the gentle voice he'd once used to calm frightened tourists. "Let's see what we can do about getting you patched up." It took considerable patience and half a pack of beef jerky from Pete's pocket, but eventually he managed to coax the dog out of his hiding spot. The animal was clearly desperate for human contact, leaning heavily against Pete's leg once he was within reach. "Rusty," Pete read from the dog tag, scratching behind the animal's ears. "Well, Rusty, looks like you've had yourself quite an adventure. Question is, what are we going to do about it?" The sensible thing would be to hike down to the ranger station and report finding a lost pet, Pete knew the protocols, knew there were probably people looking for this dog, but it would mean dealing with search teams, worried owners, paperwork, and all the complications that came with re-entering the human world he'd worked so hard to leave behind. Instead, Pete found himself fashioning a makeshift stretcher from pine branches and his spare jacket. Rusty was too injured to make the hike back to the cabin on his own, and Pete wasn't about to leave him in the ravine overnight with mountain lions and bears on the prowl. The trip back took over an hour, with Pete stopping frequently to rest and check on his patient. Rusty seemed to understand that he was being helped, lying quietly on the stretcher and only whimpering when the terrain got particularly rough. Pete's cabin was a study in functional simplicity. One room with a stone fireplace, a kitchen area with a wood-burning stove, and basic furniture he'd built himself from local timber. He'd never intended it to serve as a veterinary clinic, but he'd doctored enough injured animals over the years to know the basics. He settled Rusty on a pile of old blankets near the fireplace and began his examination. The sprained leg would heal on its own with rest, and the scratches were superficial once cleaned with warm water and antiseptic. What the dog needed most was food, water, and time to recover. Over the following days, Pete found himself settling into a routine he hadn't experienced in years. He'd wake at dawn to check on Rusty, prepare meals for both of them, take the dog outside for short walks as his strength returned. In the evenings, they'd sit by the fire while Pete read or worked on small repairs around the cabin. What surprised Pete most was how naturally Rusty adapted to mountain life. The dog seemed to understand that this was a place of healing, showing none of the restless energy Pete associated with house pets. Instead, Rusty was content to lie by the fire, occasionally venturing out to explore the immediate area around the cabin, but always returning. Before Pete began to worry, "You're not like most domestic dogs, are you?" Pete observed one evening as Rusty lay beside his chair, golden fur glowing in the firelight. "Got some wild in you, some understanding of how things work up here." As the weeks passed, Pete began to dread the inevitable decision he'd have to make. Rusty was healing well. His limp had disappeared entirely, and the scratches had faded to faint lines in his coat. Soon he'd be strong enough to make the journey back to civilization, back to whatever life he'd had before ending up in that ravine. But Pete had grown attached to the dog's quiet companionship, the way Rusty seemed to sense his moods and respond accordingly. After years of solitude, he'd forgotten how comforting it could be to have another living creature share his space, someone who asked for nothing more than food, shelter, and the occasional scratch behind the ears. One morning in late October, Pete woke to find Rusty sitting by the cabin door, staring out at the forest with unusual intensity. When Pete opened the door, the dog bounded outside and began pacing at the edge of the clearing, whining softly. "What is it, boy?" Pete asked, following him outside. "What's got you all stirred up?" That's when he heard them, distant voices calling a name that made his heart sink. "Rusty, here." "Boy, Rusty." The search party was still far away, probably following the creek that led past Pete's ravine, but they were definitely heading in his direction. And from the sound of it, they had dogs of their own to help with tracking. Pete looked down at Rusty, who was torn between running toward the voices and staying with the man who'd saved his life. The conflict was written clearly in the dog's posture, ears pricked toward the distant calls, but feet planted firmly beside Pete's boots. "Go on," Pete said quietly, his voice rougher than usual. "Those are your people out there. They've been looking for you." But Rusty just whined and pressed closer to Pete's leg, as if he could somehow communicate that he'd found a new home, a new purpose in these mountains. The voices were getting closer. Luna Vasquez adjusted the telephoto lens on her camera and settled deeper into her hiding spot. Among the aspen trees, she'd been tracking the small pack of elk for 3 days, hoping to capture the perfect shot of them grazing in the morning light filtering through the golden leaves. Wildlife photography required endless patience, but moments like these made every uncomfortable night spent sleeping in her truck worthwhile. Through her viewfinder, she watched the elk move gracefully across the meadow, their breath creating small puffs of vapor in the crisp mountain air. Luna was about to take her shot when movement at the edge of the frame caught her attention. Something golden was moving through the trees, too large to be a fox, too small to be a deer. She swung her camera toward the movement and felt her breath catch. A golden retriever was padding silently along the tree line, but this wasn't any ordinary house pet. The dog moved with the fluid confidence of a wild animal, every step calculated and purposeful. His coat had grown thick and slightly unkempt, and there was something in his bearing that spoke of months spent adapting to life in the wilderness. Luna had been photographing wildlife in the Colorado Rockies for 8 years, and she'd never seen anything quite like this. Domestic dogs didn't typically survive long in the backcountry. They lacked the instincts and skills necessary to find food, avoid predators, and navigate the harsh seasonal changes. Yet here was clear evidence that at least one had not only survived, but appeared to be thriving. She began photographing immediately, her camera's motor drive whirring softly as she captured frame after frame. The dog seemed aware of her presence, but showed no fear, continuing his patrol of the meadow's perimeter with calm alertness. Occasionally he would pause to investigate a scent or listen to some distant sound, and Luna found herself captivated by the intelligence evident in his every movement. Over the following weeks, Luna made the golden retriever the focus of her work. She learned his patterns, discovered the network of trails he traveled, identified the sheltered spots where he rested during the heat of the day. What she documented challenged everything she thought she knew about domestic animals and their capacity for adaptation. The dog had clearly learned to hunt small game. She photographed him successfully catching rabbits and even a young marmot. He'd mastered the art of fishing in the mountain streams, standing motionless in the shallows until trout came within reach of his lightning-fast strikes. Most remarkably, he'd learned to cache food during times of abundance, burying surplus catches in hidden spots throughout his territory. "This is incredible," Luna murmured to herself as she reviewed the images on her camera's LCD screen. "He's not just surviving, he's actually adapting, developing wild behaviors." But perhaps most fascinating was the dog's relationship with the other wildlife in the area. Rather than being seen as a threat or an anomaly, he appeared to have been accepted as part of the ecosystem. Luna observed him drinking peacefully from streams while deer grazed nearby, watched him give respectful distance to a mother bear and her cubs, saw him share a sunny hillside with a family of marmots without any apparent tension. The story began to take shape in Luna's mind. Not just a collection of beautiful wildlife photographs, but a documentation of something truly extraordinary. She started keeping detailed field notes, recording the dog's behaviors, mapping his territory, noting his interactions with other animals, and his responses to changing weather conditions. One particularly memorable morning, Luna witnessed something that made her realize the full scope of what she was documenting. A violent thunderstorm had moved through the area overnight, bringing heavy rain and hail that sent most wildlife seeking shelter. As dawn broke and the storm clouds cleared, Luna expected to find the forest quiet and still as animals slowly emerged from their hiding places. Instead, she found the golden retriever methodically checking a series of locations throughout his territory. At first, Luna thought he was simply resuming his normal patrol routine. But as she followed at a distance, she realized he was actually checking on other animals, investigating the burrow where a family of prairie dogs had taken refuge, visiting the rocky overhang where he'd seen bighorn sheep shelter during previous storms, even approaching the den where a red fox had recently given birth to kits. "He's not just surviving," Luna whispered, her camera capturing his gentle investigation of a fallen bird that had been injured by hail. "He's caring for his community." The dog's behavior toward the injured bird was particularly revealing. Rather than seeing it as potential prey, he sniffed it carefully, then began what could only be described as protective behavior, lying down nearby to keep watch, occasionally nudging the bird with his nose as if encouraging it to move to better shelter. Luna spent the entire day documenting this extraordinary display of interspecies compassion. By evening, the bird had recovered enough to flutter to a low branch, and the dog had moved on to continue his rounds. But the implications of what she'd witnessed kept Luna awake long into the night. She began researching cases of feral domestic animals, looking for parallels to what she was observing. What she found was that while some cats adapted reasonably well to wild living, dogs rarely survived more than a few months without human care. The few documented cases of long-term survival typically involved dogs that had reverted to aggressive, purely predatory behavior. This dog was different. Rather than becoming more wolf-like, he seemed to have developed his own unique approach to wilderness living, one that emphasized integration rather than domination, cooperation rather than competition. Luna's portfolio of images grew to include hundreds of photographs spanning different seasons and situations. She captured him playing in fresh snowfall, navigating spring floods, enduring summer heat waves, and preparing for winter by growing an even thicker coat and increasing his food caching behavior. But it was the portrait photographs that truly told his story, close-ups that revealed eyes that held both wildness and memory, a face that had adapted to mountain living while retaining hints of domestic gentleness. These images spoke of a creature caught between two worlds, thriving in one while perhaps still longing for another. Luna knew she had something special, something that could change how people thought about the relationship between domestic and wild animals. But as she prepared to compile her work into a portfolio for publication, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was documenting more than just a remarkable survival story somewhere. She suspected someone was still looking for this dog, someone who loved him and missed him and had probably never stopped hoping for his return. The question that haunted her was whether revealing his location would be a kindness or a betrayal of the wild creature he'd become. As autumn deepened and her documentation project neared completion, Luna found herself faced with the same dilemma that had confronted old Pete Henderson months earlier. Some discoveries, she was learning, came with responsibilities that went far beyond simply capturing the perfect photograph. The golden retriever had survived against all odds, but Luna was beginning to understand that survival was only part of his story. The rest would depend on choices made by the humans who'd stumbled into his remarkable new life. Emma Torres stood at the edge of the meadow, her heart hammering so hard she was certain it could be heard over the whisper of wind. Through the aspen leaves, in her hand, she clutched a worn photograph, rusty as a puppy, all oversized paws and boundless energy, taken on the day she'd brought him home from the shelter 3 years ago. 3 years. It felt like a lifetime. The call from Luna Vasquez had come 2 weeks earlier. Professional but tentative, a wildlife photographer had been documenting what appeared to be a domestic dog, living wild in the mountains, and she thought Emma might want to see the images. Emma had driven to Luna's studio in Fort Collins, with hands shaking on the steering wheel, afraid to hope but unable to stop herself. The moment Luna had pulled up the first photograph on her computer screen, Emma had burst into tears. Even with his thicker coat and the wild confidence in his bearing, she would have recognized Rusty anywhere. The distinctive white patch on his chest, the intelligent brown eyes, the way he held his head when listening. It was unmistakably her dog. Now, after weeks of planning and preparation, she was here. Jake Mitchell stood beside her, his search and rescue experience invaluable in navigating both the terrain and the complex emotions of what they were attempting. Behind them, Luna waited with her cameras, ready to document whatever was about to unfold. "Are you ready for this?" Jake asked gently. Over the months since Rusty's disappearance, he and Emma had grown close, their shared experience of loss creating a bond that had slowly deepened into something more. But today wasn't about their relationship. It was about a reunion 3 years in the making. Emma nodded, not trusting her voice. According to Luna's observations, Rusty typically appeared in this meadow during the early morning hours, following a routine he'd maintained for months. If the pattern held, they wouldn't have to wait long. The sun was just beginning to paint the peaks with golden light when Emma spotted movement at the tree line. Her breath caught as a familiar golden form emerged from the shadows, moving with the fluid grace of a creature perfectly adapted to its environment. But this wasn't the Rusty she remembered. The dog that stepped into the meadow was larger, more muscled, his coat thick and wild-looking. He moved with confident awareness of his surroundings, pausing frequently to test the wind and listen for sounds that human ears couldn't detect. This was a creature that had learned to survive in one of the harshest environments on Earth. For a moment, Emma was afraid he wouldn't recognize her. 3 years was a long time in a dog's life, and Rusty had clearly become something different, something wilder than the pet she'd lost. Then he caught her scent. The transformation was instantaneous and miraculous. Rusty's head snapped up, his entire body going rigid with attention. His ears pricked forward, and Emma could see his nostrils flaring as he tested the air more carefully. For several heartbeats, dog and woman stared at each other across the 50 yards of meadow grass. "Rusty," Emma called softly, her voice breaking on his name. The sound of her voice shattered whatever hesitation remained. Rusty exploded into motion, racing across the meadow with the speed and power of a wild animal, but the single-minded focus of a dog rushing toward its beloved human. Emma ran to meet him, tears streaming down her face. Jake and Luna forgotten in the overwhelming joy of the moment. They collided in the center of the meadow, Rusty launching himself into Emma's arms with enough force to knock them both to the ground. For several minutes, they were a tangle of golden fur and tears and laughter as Rusty covered Emma's face with kisses, whining and crying with an emotion that transcended species. "I knew you were alive," Emma whispered into his fur, holding him as tightly as she dared. "I never stopped believing you'd come home." But even as she reveled in their reunion, Emma could feel the difference in him. Rusty was more than just physically changed. There was something in his bearing, an awareness and confidence that spoke of hard-won survival skills and experiences that had fundamentally altered who he was after the initial explosion of joy subsided. Rusty pulled back slightly, studying Emma's face as if trying to reconcile memory with present reality. She could see confusion in his eyes, a war between the domestic dog he'd been and the wild creature he'd become. "It's okay," she told him, her voice steady despite her tears. "I understand. You're different now. We both are." Jake approached slowly, giving Rusty space to decide how he felt about other humans. The dog watched him carefully but without fear, eventually allowing Jake to extend his hand for a cautious sniff. Luna remained at a respectful distance, her camera capturing the entire reunion with the reverence the moment deserved. "What happens now?" Jake asked quietly as Emma continued to hold and pet Rusty, both of them seeming to drink in each other's presence. It was the question Emma had been avoiding since Luna's phone call. She'd spent 3 years dreaming of this moment, but she'd imagined it would be simple. Find Rusty, bring him home, resume their old life together. Now, seeing what he'd become, she realized nothing about this situation was simple. Rusty had created a life here, developed skills and relationships and routines that were as far removed from domestic pet life as could be imagined. Could she really ask him to give all that up to return to apartment living and leash walks and the confined world of human civilization? "I don't know," she admitted, her hands never stopping their gentle stroking of Rusty's coat. "I always thought I'd bring him home, but look at him. He's not the same dog I lost." As if sensing her dilemma, Rusty suddenly stood and walked a few steps toward the tree line, then stopped and looked back at her expectantly. The message was clear. He wanted her to follow, to see the world he'd made for himself. Emma looked at Jake, who nodded encouragingly. "We've got time," he said. "Let him show you." For the next hour, Rusty led them on a tour of his territory. He showed them the stream where he fished, the rocky overhang where he sheltered during storms, the network of game trails he'd learned to navigate. Emma watched in amazement as wild animals acknowledged his presence without fear, deer stepping aside respectfully, a red-tailed hawk calling what sounded like a greeting from overhead. "He's not just surviving," she realized aloud. "He's part of this place now. He belongs here." The tour ended at a small clearing where the remains of an old cabin were barely visible. Beneath decades of forest growth, Rusty led them to a spot, beneath a large pine tree where the ground was soft with needles, clearly a favorite resting place. He lay down and looked up at Emma. Expectantly. Emma understood. She sat beside him, Jake settling nearby, and for a while they simply existed together, in the peaceful silence of the mountains. This was Rusty's way of sharing his world with her, of showing her that his life here wasn't just about survival. It was about belonging to something larger than himself. As the morning wore on, Emma found herself faced with the most difficult decision of her life. She could insist that Rusty return with her, could use his love and loyalty to convince him to abandon this wild existence. But would that be love, or would it be selfishness? I have an idea, Jake said eventually, as if reading her thoughts. What if we split the difference? Emma looked at him questioningly. I've been thinking about a career change anyway, he continued. Luna mentioned there's an old ranger station about 5 miles from here that's been abandoned for years. What if we fixed it up, made it livable? We could spend part of the year here, part of it in town. Rusty could choose, day by day, which world he wants to be in. The solution was so perfect, so obviously right, that Emma wondered why she hadn't thought of it herself. She looked down at Rusty, who seemed to be following their conversation with intelligent attention. What do you think, boy? She asked. Would you like that, having both worlds? Rusty's tail thumped against the pine needles, and Emma could swear. She saw approval in his warm brown eyes. He stood and walked to Jake, offering his head for petting, a gesture of trust and acceptance that brought fresh tears to Emma's eyes. As they prepared to leave the meadow that first day, Emma knew their relationship had changed forever. Rusty would never again be just her pet, and she would never again be just his owner. They had become something new, partners in a life that bridged two worlds, companions who had learned that love sometimes meant letting go, and that the strongest bonds were those that allowed for growth and change. 3 years after a bear encounter had torn them apart, Emma and Rusty had found each other again. But more importantly, they had found a way to honor both the dog he'd been and the wild creature he'd become. Their reunion wasn't an ending, it was a beginning. The start of a new kind of love story written in mountain meadows and forest clearings, where a golden retriever could be both wild and beloved, free and cherished, exactly as he was meant to be.